This video is about the basics of percentages, and percentages are chapter 7 in our book. Percentages are related to fractions and decimals. We've already looked at the connection between fractions and decimals and learned how to change between them. And in this video, we're going to learn how to change between fractions and percentages and between decimals and percentages. So what's the process? Well, if I want to change from a fraction to a percentage, then what I'll need to do is multiply the fraction by 100. And if I want to go the other way, from percentage to a fraction, then I'll want to divide by 100. The reason the 100 is so important in these calculations is actually in the word percentage itself. You can see here it's per cent, so it's per 100, and that's where the 100 comes from. So let's look at an example. Let's change 2/5 to a percentage. So let's look back to our rule, changing from a fraction to a percentage. I'm going to multiply by 100. If you like, you can write this as 100 over 1, but 100 by itself will do as well. If we can cancel a little, we will. And here we can see that the 5 and the 100 have a common factor. 5 will go into both of them. So 5 goes into 5 once, and 5 goes into 100 20 times. And now I'll multiply. And on the top, I'll get 2 by 20, which is 40. On the bottom, it's just 1 by 1, which is 1. And 40 over 1, of course, is 40. So my answer is 40%. So here's a question for you now. Change 13 over 20 to a percentage. Pause the video here while you do that and then play and check if you're correct. Okay, so again, to change a fraction to a percentage, I'm going to multiply by 100. So I'm going to times this by 100, and if you like, you can write that as 100 over 1. And then any cancelling is going to be our next step. So we look and we see that 20 will go into 100. So 20 and 20 goes once, 20 into 100 goes 5 times, and now we'll multiply. So multiplying on top, 13 by 5 is going to give me 65. On the bottom, 1 by 1 is 1. And of course, 65 over 1 can be just written as 65. So my answer is 65%. Let's look at a second example. This time I want to change 1/3 to a percentage. So again, it's the exact same process. To go from a fraction to a percentage, I'm going to multiply by 100. So I'm going to say 1/3 times 100. And again, if you like, you can write this as 100 over 1. Now, this time there's no cancelling possible, so I'll just multiply. 1 by 100 on top will give me 100. And on the bottom, 3 by 1 will give me 3. But I don't like to leave my percentages as improper fractions. If they turn out like this, I want to write them as mixed numbers. So take a moment there to see, can you change 100 over 3 into a mixed number? Okay, so 3 into 100 goes 33 times, and there's 1 left over. So my answer is going to be 33 and 1/3%. Now a question for you. Change 1/6 to a percentage. So pause the video here while you try that yourself, and then play and see if you're correct. So we're using the same rules before. I'm going to multiply by 100. And just like in previous examples, we can put this as 100 over 1 if we like. There's a little bit of cancelling possible this time. 2 goes into 6 3 times. And 2 goes into 100 50 times. That's all the cancelling I can do. When I multiply, I'm going to get 1 by 50, which is 50, over 3 by 1, which is 3. Again, we don't like to leave our answer for percentages as improper fractions, so we'll change this now into a mixed number. When we do that, we're going to find that 3 goes into 50 16 times, and 2 left over, so it's 16 and 2/3%. It's a good plan to have a little rough work column going for calculations like this. Okay, so now that we're familiar with how to change from a fraction to a percentage, let's look at how to go the other way. So here's an example. We want to change 42% to a fraction. Now remember that we said that to go from a fraction to a percentage, we times by 100, and to go from a percentage to a fraction, we divide by 100. Well, when we want to get a fraction result, the best way to divide by 100 is to take your percentage and put it over 100. And this instantly creates a fraction. We do like to give our answers in their lowest terms or in their simplest form, so that means we need to cancel down. So take a moment now to that yourself and then play and see if you're correct. So in this case, 2 will go into 42, and that'll go in 21 times, and 2 will go into 150 times, And that's the only common factor. So that'll be my answer, 21/50. Here's one for you. Change 64% to a fraction. So pause the video, try the question, and then play and see if you're correct. So again, to change from a percentage to a fraction, we're going to divide by 100. And the simplest thing to do is simply put the number in the percentage over 100. And now that I've written it as a fraction, I want to cancel if at all possible. So let's have a look. What do 64 and 100 have as a common factor? Well, if we aim low, 2 will definitely go into them, but I think we can work with something a bit bigger. So you might notice that 4 also goes into both. So 4 goes into 64 16 times, and 4 goes into 100 25 times. And that's all the cancelling down that I can do, so that'll be my solution. And that's 16/25. So here's another example. This time we want to change 5.5% into a fraction. So again, same as before, if we want to go from a percentage to a fraction, we're going to divide by 100. And the easiest way to do that is simply put the number in the percentage over 100. Even though it'll look a bit funny initially here because it's 5.5, but we'll still do it the same way to begin. And in a case like this, instead of trying to cancel down, first of all, what I try to do is I try to sort out my fractions so that my numerator no longer has a fraction in it. So to do that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to have a look at the denominator here, which is 2, and I'm going to multiply the top and the bottom of my fraction by that. So I'm going to multiply 5.5 by 2. So what will I get for that? Well, 5.5 by 2 is going to give me 11. Again, it might be a good plan to have a little rough work column going on here for your calculations. And on the bottom, 100 by 2 is going to give you 200. And you'll notice that 11 and 200 don't have any common factors, so I can't cancel any more than that, and that's my final answer. So here's one for you now. I want you to change 3 1/3% to a fraction. So pause the video here while you do that, and then play and see if you're correct. Okay, so again, we're changing from a percentage to a fraction. So we're dividing by 100. The easiest thing to do is simply put our percentage, 3 1/3, over 100. We're not overly keen on there being a fraction in our numerator. So we're going to multiply both the top and bottom of our fraction by whatever the number is down here. So we're multiplying the top of our fraction by 3 and the bottom of our fraction by 3 also. And then if you need to use a rough work column for your calculation for the top, that's totally fine. So 3 1/3 by 3 is going to give me 10. And then 100 by 3 is going to give me 300. And if it's possible to cancel down, we should. So you should notice at this point that there's a common factor of 10. 10 will go into both. So 10 into 10 will go once, and 10 into 300 will go 30 times. So that's going to be my final answer then, 1/30. Don't forget that if you need to go back and rewatch any of this to remind yourself of how it works, you can rewind, replay, or pause at any time. And once you've done that, and if you're comfortable with fractions and percentages and changing between them, then continue on with the video and we'll look next how to change between decimals and percentages. So first of all, let's establish the rule for changing between decimals and percentages. And it's interesting to note that it's actually the exact same rule that we use for changing between fractions and percentages. So if we need to go from decimal to percentage, we're going to multiply by 100. And if we want to go from percentage to decimal, we're going to divide by 100. And I'd strongly recommend that you have these rules written somewhere nice and clearly in your copy for quick reference. So let's go through some examples and problems to figure out how this works. Let's start by changing a decimal into a percentage. So we're going to change 0.245 to a percentage. So like we said, to change from decimal to percent, we're going to multiply by 100. So let's write that calculation down. And of course, we have a nice quick way of multiplying by 100 when we're looking at a decimal. So all we have to do is locate our decimal point and then move it 2 places to the right. So I'm going to move it over here in between the 4 and the 5. And my solution so is going to be 24.5%. So here's your question. I want you to change 0.032 to a percentage. Pause the video here, try the question, and then play and see if you're correct. So don't forget to change from a decimal to a percentage. I'm going to multiply by 100. So I'm going to times my decimal by 100. And then again, to multiply by 100, we just move our decimal place 2 places to the right. So in this case, my answer is going to be 3.2%. Let's do another example. So this time we want to change 0.3 to a percentage. If you're feeling confident about how to do this, maybe pause the video and try it yourself. Otherwise, follow on with me. So I've got 0.3 and I want to multiply it by 100. And of course, this means that I want to move my decimal place 2 places to the right, but I've got no other numbers after that 3. So don't forget, what I can do to fill the gap is put in a few zeros. And now I can just do what I did before, which is to move my decimal place 2 places to the right. And so it's going to land in between these 2 extra zeros. So my answer then is going to be 30%. If there's any zeros after the decimal place, I can just leave them out. So now a question for you. Change 0.1 to a percentage. So pause the video here while you try this one yourself and then play and see if you're correct. Okay, so I've got 0.1. So to change to a percentage, of course, I'm going to multiply by 100. I know that I'm going to want to move my decimal place to the right, but I've got nothing to position it between, so I'll stick on a few extra zeros. And now I can just move my decimal place 2 places to the right. And my answer so is going to be 10%. Okay, so now let's try going the other way, this time from a percentage to a decimal. So for that, we're going to have to divide by 100, and again, we'll be able to move decimal places to get our answers. So here's an example for that. I want to change 28% to a decimal. So like we said, we're going to divide by 100. Let's write that down first. And again, it's going to be to do with decimal places. So I'm going to first of all identify in that 28, where could I put a decimal place? Well, 28's decimal place doesn't generally get written down, but it's at the end of the number. So what I can do now to divide by 100 is I can move my decimal place 2 places to the left. If you like, you can put a 0 in front there so that you've got a number on the other side of that decimal place once it's been moved. And so 28% as a decimal is just 0.28. Okay, here's one for you now. So change 32% to a decimal. Pause the video here while you do that and then check and see if you're correct. So I'll take 32, and again, to change from percentage to decimal, I'll just divide by 100. I'll locate my decimal point in my number 32, and it's at the end there, and I'll move it 2 places to the left. If I like, I can put a 0 on the far side of it, so I've got a figure to hold that place. And my answer then is going to be 0.32. So 32% as a decimal is just 0.32. You can see here how with the decimals in particular, after a bit of practice, it actually becomes very simple to do these ones mentally. So when you get good at it, you'll be able to do that, no problem. But at the beginning, especially if you find it tricky, make sure to write your calculations down nice and clearly. Okay, let's do one last example then. So I want to change 2.5% into a decimal. The first thing to note is that it's a bit awkward to do this when it's written as 2.5%. So I'm going to start by taking that 2.5% and writing it as 2.5%. Just note that even though there's a decimal in this now, this is not my final answer. This is still the percentage value. Okay, so now I want to change from a percentage to a decimal, so I'll follow that rule of divide by 100. So what I'm going to want to do is take that decimal place and move it 2 places to the left. But again, I've got no numbers over there in order to kind of position my decimal place correctly. So I can stick a few extra zeros in the start in order to help me out with that. And then my decimal place is going to move 2 places to the left, and it's going to land over here. So my answer is going to be 0.025. So 2.5% as a decimal is 0.025. And now here's one last question for you. And this time I want you to change 8.5% to a decimal. So pause the video here, do the question, and then play to see if you're correct. Okay, so again, I don't really like the look of 8.5% when I want to change it into a decimal. So I'm first of all going to rewrite this. And a nicer way of writing it is 8.5%. Because then I can clearly see where my decimal place is located, and it makes it much easier to move things around. So for my calculation then, to change from a percent to a decimal, I'm going to divide by 100. Again, this will mean that I'll move my decimal place a few places to the left. So again, I'll stick in a few of those zeros to help me out. And then that decimal place is going to move 2 places to the left when I divide by 100. So it's going to land up here. And when I write my answer down at the end, my answer is going to be 0.085. So here we are at the end of the video. So don't forget, if at any stage you can't remember how to do any of the processes that we did in this video, go back and rewatch it again. And even when you're doing your questions from your book, if you get stuck on something, come back and look at the appropriate example and question to give you a nudge in the right direction.